a very huge issue that has been affecting not only Kenya, but also the East African region, the floods.
Yes.
It was definitely not one of the things we're going to talk about, but of course, it's a very pertinent contemporary issue at the moment.
That's for sure.
What's your take about the amount of, let's say, the economic cost it will have on the Kenyan economy?
It's quite huge. Actually, the natural calamities, they do affect the developing economies in a bigger way than it does the developed economies. And it is so unfortunate that these calamities are largely being caused or triggered by the developed economies. And the people who are on the receiving end is the developing economies. Remember, it comes about the issue about climate change because of pollution of air and the general ecosystem. So that's why we are seeing floods happening at a higher rate. The issue of fire, the issue of, actually they are called the 3 Fs, floods, fire, and famine. So at the end of the day, the people who are causing these calamities to happen, they don't get... they don't suffer. They are not the ones who are suffering the most. But as Kenyans, Africa at large, we are on the receiving end. Recently, I had the president of Kenya saying that before floods started, the number of kids who were on the feeding program were about 1.5 million. But now after the flood started, now they are planning to increase the number of children who will be in that program to about 3 million. So he's saying that he will have to cut money and funds or resources that would have gone to development agenda to now feeding those children.
They will have to be reallocated.
They will have to be reallocated, which is quite unfortunate.
I was reading, I think it's a report by the World Bank. I think about 10 years ago something. So they were looking at the floods in 97, 98. I mean, I was a kid back then, I think 8 years old. I think you are, hopefully you are much more older.
A bit older.
Yes. Do you remember that floods? And if you compare it with what we've been having over the past month, because a couple of colleagues of mine, they were much older than me. We were talking with them about it earlier this week. And one of them was telling me that he remembers it, but it was much more slow. It was not as intense. But then I think it started in November of 97 until March of 98. So it was like 4 months. While with this one, I think it's mostly been during April.
Do
you have any recollections of the floods? How big it was?
Yes, I do remember. Of course, I was younger. I remember very well. I think I'm very good with the dates because I was actually in class 7. In the village. So I remember...
In which county?
In Murang'a County. In Murang'a County. So, of course, the damage, the effect, and the impact of those prolonged rains were not as much as we have experienced today. But mainly because I would think even the intensity that we have experienced this time around is higher than it was experienced about maybe 15 years ago. In terms of maybe even encroaching on riparian reserve, people building around the waterways. That time it was not much
of an issue.
Much of an issue. But currently with the issue of urbanization, people moving from rural to urban areas. Now
the urban density that comes with it. And then you block all the waterways. And then it just goes downhill from that.
Actually, it is unfortunate that the current governor of Nairobi, Sakaja, is not very keen to first expand the infrastructure before actually recommending that we cannot start doing buildings up to the 25th story. Yes. So it's I think that amounts to putting the cart before the horse or before the donkey. We should start with the infrastructure. And once we are good to go, now we can now start developing vertically.
And actually, if you look at, let's say, Tatu City, or also Konza Technopolis, they are all going with that particular idea. You first start with laying the infrastructure and everything.
Yes.
You build it up, and then people will come.
That's for sure.
But you don't go the other way around.
You don't go the other way around. And it's a big question about how is public participation supposed to happen? Because most Nairobians are saying we don't want that. We have already started seeing the disadvantages of having many buildings coming up without being supported by proper infrastructure. But now the executive of the county of Nairobi, they are saying we have no choice. Whether you like it or you don't like
we
it.
have to build up.
In Kiswahili, the way they say upende usipende, we have to go up.
Yeah. The report I looked at,
yes,
I think they quoted something like the floods in 97-98, they cost Kenya, I think, around 70 billion shillings. And the subsequent drought that came with it until the year 2000, because of course, unfortunately, when the floods come like the way they did, and in the planting season, then unfortunately we know drought is around the corner.
Yes.
And the subsequent drought over 98, 99 until 2000, I think they put the cost at around 220 billion. So that the combined economic cost was around 290 billion, which at the time, I think corresponded to about 14% of Kenya's GDP. And of course, like I looked up the figure of Kenya's GDP, I think from a World Bank report in 97, 98, they had it at about 14 billion US dollars. And IMF had it somewhere around 18. But still, like if you combine the two phenomena, El Niño, La Niña, 300 billion shillings roughly to the GDP at the time. It's not a direct line that you can draw from then to now. But do you think like it will be somewhere in that region, like the economic cost to Kenya, for instance?
Yeah, I feel it will be quite high. It will be quite high. And now that you have mentioned in 1998, maybe it did, the government of Kenya spent about 70 billion. I'm quite surprised because my
that was the cost.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I think they received funding, emergency funding, especially from the World Bank.
Yes.
To reconstruct the roads because a lot of roads were destroyed.
Bridges.
And I already think this time round, roads have been destroyed across the country. Bridges, classrooms, so that even in schools, money that maybe could have gone to, let's say, you had mentioned the feeding program.
Yes, the feeding program.
Or buying books. It will have to be maybe reallocated and repurposed. To build classrooms.
Yeah, actually I wanted to say that I remember by the time Moi was leaving office, the last budget he read was for 250 billion. That was in 2002.
Okay.
So when we talk 70 billion in 1998, so I would think if budget for Kenya in 2002 was about 250 billion, it must have been maybe 200 billion in 1998.
Yeah.
So almost 30% of
almost 30%.
Yes, of the country's GDP was
of the country's budget.
Budget exactly, not GDP of the country's budget was utilized in fighting those calamities. So even today, maybe it would not, of course, get to 30%, but it would be a significant figure.
Yeah.
And largely, sometimes we tend to only quantify the financial cost, the economic cost, but economical cost. But when it comes to maybe the issue of death, even something like now the schools have to be the opening of the schools have to be postponed by 2 weeks.
Yeah.
There are so many unsaid losses that people have suffered.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, it is not only the financial cost, but even social cost and other costs that come with that kind of a calamity.
Yeah, I mean,